Well, good morning, everybody. It's Sunday. It's the 17th of May, and I hope you're all joining me ready with a cuppa for another in the series of Elevenses, broadcast here from London by Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. What have I got for you in the show today? I've got a mixed bag of news, views, comments. We're going to have a look at a new Honda, which may or may not appear. Something a little bit out of the ordinary. It's a 4-cylinder adventure bike, and I'll be talking about that and wondering if it could, in fact, become a bit of a hit. Piaggio have equipped an MP3 with wings. We'll have a look at what that might mean as well. Elsewhere in the show, I'll be talking about David Hough's book, Proficient Motorcycling, the changes to the Learner A2 category motorcycles and what the DVSA response to that is. And I've forgotten what else I was going to put in the show, actually. Oh, yes, what's going on with the use of motorcycles sort of post-coronavirus. So, right, okay, anyway, on with the show fairly quickly. Let's start with the news items first. Something that caught my eye, nothing actually to do with motorcycling, but a motorcycling buddy who lives in the area sent it to me. We mentioned the sort of motorcyclists coming off and using up resources. Well, obviously the NHS is not quite under the pressure it was just recently, but there's still a lot of motorcyclists out there. But it's not just motorcyclists crashing. He sent me a story about a paraglider who somehow managed to fly into the side of a hill in Newbury. A really awkward place to get to. They actually had to get the Coast Guard helicopter out in the end to get this poor guy off the hillside. So yeah, it's not just motorcyclists who are doing daft things at the moment, but again, my newsfeed is still full of crashes, fatal and serious injuries. One just down in Devon area I know fairly well during the week as well. Right, anyway, moving on rapidly. One of the things I did mention last week was that the EU are changing their rules for the sub 47 horsepower A2 license category, which basically allows riders to train for that test on a smaller bike. Under the previous system, the EU rules, which Britain subscribed to, of course, required the A2 test to be taken on a bike with a minimum capacity of 400 cc's, which made life a little bit tricky for the trainers, as there weren't that many bikes in that class at the time when the rules came in. So some schools have actually ended up using things like XJ6 diversion, which I ride, and with a restrictor kit on it, which isn't ideal. And what it means is that there's a fairly big and bulky bike with the test being taken on, aimed at someone who may never intend to ride a bike that big. And the complaints have been that they are physically heavy and physically quite tall, and that doesn't suit smaller riders who may not want to ride a motorcycle that size. So the change in the test bike specification lowers the minimum to 250 cc's. Now, I did make a slight boo-boo last week. I suggested that might mean that 250 cc bikes were capable of being used to take this test. That's not strictly correct, because the minimum is 250. Of course, any bike labelled as a 250 is almost certain to be under 250, usually 248 or 249. So what effectively it means is that the limit will sit at the sort of 300 cc bikes, such as the G310 BMW, KTM's 390 Dukes, the Honda's CB300, and I'd completely forgotten about, the Versys 300, which is an interesting looking little machine. So all those would be eligible under this rule change. The good news is that obviously that some of those bikes are physically smaller and lighter, which makes it easier for riders who are, let's say, less tall in stature to take their test on it. I also pointed out that although the UK is in the transition to leave the EU right at this moment, it's almost certain we would remain aligned with cross-border on this one, because it basically maintains license standards. And that means we don't return to the old situation of having to take tests in different countries every time people move. And there are a lot of people who do move around and are resident. And it's obviously one of the big benefits of the EU was that they could just take their driving license and do an exchange on it. DVSA have acknowledged that there are benefits for riders and trainers, and what they say is we'll be consulting on those changes. Now, those bikes are cheaper, generally speaking, than the bigger machines, so expect the training industry to give it a big thumbs up. Anything that sells well will get the approval of the bike industry itself, and I suspect that there'll be some riders out there also supporting that. So I suspect we'll probably move in line with the EU on this one. Okay, so still to come, we've got a review of David Hough's motorcycle. I'll be looking again at where post-motorcycling pandemic, post-pandemic motorcycling, I should say, is going. And we'll do a biking fit. That was the item I'd completely forgotten. I'd made a note to say. I was going to talk about neck muscles and how we can do some work on those. Right, okay, on to the next item then. Let's just see if I can get the picture up that I wanted. Dear, where's it gone? I've lost the relevant button. There it is. Share screen. Microsoft Tab. I should have set this up earlier. Let's have a look at that. There we go. That's what I wanted to show you. Looks a bit of a dog's dinner, doesn't it, really? But we'll come on to that. The current generation of riders has grown up with the idea that we have to have a big bike for it to be an adventure bike. And we've also grown up with the idea that it has to be a twin. And the usual arguments are that big twins are lighter, more maneuverable than four-cylinder machines. Guess what? It ignores one of the most successful Paris-Dakar rally bikes ever. and that was the 4-cylinder YZE850, which was based on the FZ750 sports bike. I owned one of the FZs years ago. Lovely motorcycle, lovely engine. Now, that monster 4-cylinder motorcycle was built for the job. Obviously, sort of production engine, but that was about it. Everything else was built for the race. And it won the Dakar 6 times in 7 years. So it was pretty damn successful as a motorcycle. Rumour has it was a bit of a handful, but I doubt if it was much more of a handful than any of the sort of specials that are built for that race now. So it seems that Honda may possibly have had a quick back glance into the history books, because it seems that what they're working on is an inline 4 adventure bike, which you can see in the picture. Now, it's likely to be powered by their 650 motor, which you'll find in the Honda CBR 650. A concept of this was shown at one of the 2019 bike shows just before Christmas, and it was called the CB4X. The basic premise appears to be sort of the crossover tourer with some modest off-road capability. Normally we think about 4-cylinder engines as not on cast wheels as not suitable for off-roading, but Honda have already got some form in this department with the 800cc Cross Runner, of course, and the 1200cc Cross Tourer. Now, personally, I looked at that and I had to say I'm not hooked by that look at all. It reminds me very much of the old and rather uninspired CBF 600, if you remember that bike. Worthy though it wasn't very pretty, and it was somewhat uninspired as a riding machine as well. And that's what it reminds me of, how with somebody having sawn the rear seat off. What is it with modern bikes that passenger accommodation is always an afterthought? And it appears that it's on stilts as well to give it a bit of extra ground clearance. You'll notice there doesn't appear to be any bash plate under the engine as well, so that's something to think about. But like a lot of those machines, it could be more than the sum of the parts. I think the revised engine characteristics and right gearing, it could actually make for a very relaxed road bike for long road trips. And the nice thing about having a 600 is you don't actually sacrifice the sporting capability of the motor. Now, the soft long travel suspension on bikes like this makes a huge amount of sense given the potholes and general state of the roads. I certainly enjoyed riding the Tracer over in New Zealand. V-twins have a reputation for lots of torque, but it often is at the expense of flexibility. They may not rev particularly well, and they may be a bit lumpy at the bottom end, which means that you kind of often trapped in 2 or 3 gears on those. I remember riding the original DL1000 V-Strom, and that was a monster and a rocket ship as far as getting up and going was concerned. You couldn't get out of second gear around town. The engine was that unflexible. The 4-cylinder engines are much more flexible because they will pull virtually all the way through the rev range, so you can be pretty much in any gear you like and it will still go. My XJ6 30 miles an hour, you literally have a choice of each of the 6 gears. You can use any of them, they all work. Torque's a little bit overrated anyway. We bang on about big torque figures, but what's really the important number is what's called thrust, and that's the torque divided by the final drive ratio. So what you feel at the back wheel is actually a product of what gear you're in anyway, and you can get just as much thrust from a sort of a supposedly revvy engine simply by using the right gear. So it's get the gear ratios right and you can get a bike like this to shift off the line as fast as any big twin. Another complaint is that 4-cylinder engines tend to be a little bit top heavy, and you'll see that one sat fairly high up in the frame as well, so that would also move the center of mass up high. But quite frankly, you ride a big V-twin and they're not exactly anything other than a bit top heavy. One of the things I was really surprised about with the new V-Strom, which I rode, also in New Zealand, was that it actually carried a lot of weight very high, and it was actually a little bit easy for that to start toppling if you weren't careful with it. So if you can put the fuel low, maybe down over the top of the gearbox, which is in fact where the old FZ used to carry the fuel, what looked like a petrol tank was actually full of airbox. You could get that weight down lower even with that 4-cylinder engine. And the other claim is that these twins are lighter. Well, actually, they're not. If you go and look at the weight of something like the V-Strom or even the BMW twin, they're big and bulky bikes, even though they've made the last model of BMW a bit lighter. You can get a 4-cylinder sports bike engine, and you can make it quite light. In practice as well, the other thing you'll find with V-twin, not so much the BMW, but certainly the V-twins, is that they're quite long because of the angle between the two cylinders, and that makes fitting them into a compact chassis quite tricky. Now, with a 4-cylinder, modern 4-cylinder, where you've got the gearbox sort of perched almost vertically rather than laid out lengthways, you can get them to be quite compact. So you can get them into a fairly short chassis. So, final complaint is that 4-cylinders are wide engines. Well, they are, but with starter motors and the generator tucked away behind the cylinder block, they're not nearly as wide as they used to be. And frankly, if you've got the engine that high up, ground clearance is not going to be an issue anyway. So 650cc engine, possibly. The other thing that strikes my mind is that Japan usually seems to make a 400cc version, so that could make quite an interesting little mini sort of adventure bike, I think. So there we go. That's the Honda CB4X, which is at the moment a concept, but just keep an eye open for it. You may see something like that appear in the next couple of years. All right, okay, on to my book review for the day. That's the one I'm going to have to take a look at. If you can see that, it's called Proficient Motorcycling, and it's by a chap called, there's his name, David Hough. David Hough wrote the column in Motorcycle Consumer News for many years. As you can see, it's a fairly hefty book. There's quite a lot of text in there. Interestingly, like my own book, the illustrations are black and white. Which doesn't detract from the contents at all. Somebody moaned that my book was in black and white. Well, yeah, there's a perfectly good book which is also in black and white. The David Hough is, as I say, well-respected author in the US on safety issues. According to the cover notes, it's full of amusing anecdotes, helpful instruction, and detailed photos and diagrams to develop your riding skills. Now, I'll get my criticisms out of the way first of all. Maybe I've not got a transatlantic sense of humour, but as the coverage of the book is as wide as we could wish, I didn't find it particularly easy going. If you think in terms of motorcycle roadcraft as being a bit like 1950s British Pathé News, which is dry to the point of coma, that's 90s Friends, US comedy. It's kind of laboured jokes and canned laughter, and I kind of I got a little bit fed up with reading the same style of anecdote, and I tended to skip straight past them. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a mistake, because sometimes in those anecdotes there's some really good material, but the way they're written tended to sort of make me push past them and on to the rest of it. There's also a bit of imbalance in there sometimes. There's a section on super slabs, which we would call motorways here in the UK. You get to the advice in the end, a bit like riding a motorway actually, but when you finally get there, unless you have read every chatty word on the topic, you kind of find that you're going to skip past it and go on to the next section, because and you miss those real gold nuggets, and the book's full of them. It really is worth reading, but it's hard going, I think. As a DIY riding course, it covers all the bases. It's got riding kit, road surfaces, positioning, cornering, braking, throttle use. It's all in there, pretty much everything you want. It's got a proper description of counter steering. When that edition came out, it was one of the first books which had covered counter steering properly, and it's way ahead still of the latest version of Roadcraft on, by the way, which still doesn't get it entirely right. Something else Hough covers, which was a complaint about the Lee Parks book I talked about the other week. He covers the fact that all bikes are different. They handle differently, and that's very often something that we tend to forget, that what works on one machine doesn't necessarily work on another. Now, from a UK perspective, there are some imbalances which might puzzle you. For example, there are 5 pages on deer plus another half page under night riding, which is more than you'll find on cornering lines. Which is the more important, deer or corners? Well, US riders have to go round bends, and although deer are a big threat out on US roads, I quite honestly think that probably a couple of pages on deer would have done the trick there. So take a red pencil, cross out the bits that you don't like, read the good bits, and absorb it. Who's it aimed at? Well, probably it's more suited to the developing rider than the complete novice. Because there'll be too much too soon in that book, but there's enough there for certainly the developing rider, and there'll be different perspective too for the experienced rider. If all that you're reading is roadcraft and the IAM handbook, try reading this. It will give you a different impression on riding. The thing I do like about David Hough is that unlike Lee Parks, and I talked about his chatty sort of take it on trust approach, Hough does go through an explanation. He will tell you why. It's never condescending, but he explains, and I think that's a difficult balance, and he's got that pretty right. But it is a heavyweight read. It's 285 pages long, and you won't be reading that in an afternoon. So pick it up, put it down, pick it up and put it down again, read it over a period. The good far, far outweighs the not so good and the criticisms that I made earlier on. And quite frankly, there's a lot of good stuff in there that mirrors my own thinking and my own writing. And it's interesting that 2 of us across different sides of the big pond should have actually come up with many of the same ideas quite independently of each other. That should tell you something, I hope. Okay, so we are watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams. This is Survival Skills Rider Training, and it's the topical news, controversial views, and biking tips show. You can, of course, read my books if you can't ride at this moment. If you're still locking yourself down, I know a lot of people aren't, head over to my author page on Lulu, and you can find my books on riding and see how you get on with those. Right, now on with the show. I'm going to do biking fit to finish off, but before we get there, just have a think about what's going on with biking in the pandemic. Now, I'll pat myself on the back a little bit and say that my thinking here on Elevenses seems to be a little bit ahead of the curve on how to get biking going again. I talked about the growing range of sort of small, inexpensive e-bikes and how they could get people around relatively inexpensively after the lockdown. And I suggested that, there's something that perhaps we ought to be looking at. And the interesting thing is, of course, that last week we had Grant Shapps, who's the Secretary of State for Transport, answering a question by Julian Lewis, who's the MP for New Forest East and a member of the all-party motorcycling group, about why motorcycles weren't actually included in the government's post-pandemic plan. And Mr. Shapps did agree that motorcycles, in fact, are, as he said, an enormously important way of getting around. But what he was a bit vague on detail. Something else I picked up, saying only that projects were underway, including tackling potholes. Well, I'll wait till I see those filled in. But something I'd missed was that in the action plan, the government had actually promised to fast track a consultation on the currently illegal and unregulated e-scooters. So if they are thinking about putting those on the road as a means of transport for people, the emission of motorcycling, particularly the e-bike aspect of it, is even more surprising. Now, Motorcycle News had a look at this. They thought about this as well. And they went straight to Dr. Lewis, the MP who originally posed the question. And this is what Dr. Lewis actually said. We're being advised to find alternative methods to travelling on public transport. For those of us who don't feel quite up to the task of cycling significant distances, And I will interject here, there will be many of those. The motorcycle, both from the parking manoeuvrability point of view, is an obvious asset. What I wanted chaps to do was try and encourage people a bit, as riding a motorcycle really is something that people could do while there's restriction on public transport without causing the congestion of cars. The government has been reasonably flexible with putting off MOT dates, for example, and they have been giving extra opportunities to cyclists. He was generally supportive, but I was rather hoping for a little bit more in terms of specific suggestions. He did say it was an enormously important way of getting around, even with a nod to the green lobby and electric bikes, but I think they ought to be a bit more flexible, both with where they can go and also where they can park. I would have thought that maybe allowing motorcyclists to use bus lanes wouldn't be a bad idea. Now, again, just interject for a moment. That was something, again, I talked about the other week. If you're running a small electric motorcycle or a small capacity motorcycle and everything is restricted down to 20 miles an hour in the street, then I have absolutely no problem. I can't see an issue with allowing motorcycles, those small motorcycles at least, to use cycle lanes and bus lanes alongside the cycles. They're going to widen the cycle lanes. They are certainly going to constrict the main running lane. And at that point, everything in the main running lane is going to get very tangled up indeed. So it seems to me sensible to try to spread the load. And I can't see the problem with those coexisting. Where they have shared lanes in London, cyclists and motorcycles have actually cooperated fairly well. There's been relatively few incidents, far, far fewer than the cycling lobby submitted. So I can't see the problem with that. Anyway, back to what Dr. Lewis was saying. If they're expecting people to try to reduce their use of public transport, they really need to be focused on incentives for people to get on bikes and not just constantly talking about cyclists. I think the government should really put their thinking caps on and see what they can do to encourage people to use the motorcycle as a sort of happy medium. If and when Parliament comes back, I propose to get my BMW K75 out of the garage and start using it. Well, okay, with all the provisos that I've just said about big motorcycles and slow speed traffic and cycle lanes, obviously you've got more miles to do on faster roads, and a bigger bike makes sense. Anyway, predictably, the Motorcycle Industry Association, who are the body charged with protecting the interests of businesses in the motorcycling sector, have also got involved. They pointed out that Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, Jim McMahon, had also commented on the government guidance. Take a sip of tea. And what they said was the guidance fails to answer the fundamental question: how do you stop the transport network being overwhelmed when it's currently running at a fraction of its capacity? He said, whilst in the short term we may need to encourage people to drive more, we shouldn't exclude motorbikes and scooters from that conversation. So what the MCIA is doing is asking all riders to contact their local MP and to suggest that powered two-wheelers could be the perfect answer to the impending transport crisis, by telling them that PTWs in the form of low and zero emission scooters and light motorcycles are a clean and efficient mode of transport that requires little road space, blah, 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 blah. And so on. They've created a draft letter to make it easy. You can go and find that quite easily on the MCM website or on the MCIA's own site. The MCIA would also like you to forward any replies that you get to them. Right, okay, now you're watching Survival Skills, and it's Kevin Williams here with the Elevenses show. Set your alarm. We're here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and at the moment we're doing Sundays as well, so 4 shows, all at 11 o'clock BST. Just a reminder that tomorrow I will be running the second part of my special interview with Dave Moss, the suspension and bike setup guru, and he will be talking about suspension. Okay, so MP3 with wings, I mentioned. Well, this has come from the Bennett Socials page, and what they suggest is that Piaggio are developing active aero, as they call it. Now, against my better judgment, I had to find out what exactly they were on about. So what I found out was that they have a patent that shows a MP3 three-wheeler with moving winglets. There's a lot of speculation in the article about exactly why that might be. One of the things that the writer points out is that the MP3 is not exactly short of front end grip, so sticking moving winglets on the bike probably isn't going to produce much extra grip on the front of that. As he suggested, and I'd already thought about this myself actually, it's likely to be a two-wheel bike that the winglets are really intended for. Now, Piaggio are the parent company of Moto Guzzi and Aprilia. If they're going to end up anywhere, then it's likely to be on the Aprilia sports bikes. Now, the regulations in World Superbike were revised last year to allow this active aero, as it's called, provided the same system can be found on the street version of the bike. So there are various ideas about how this could work. You could generate downforce on braking to aid grip. You could also generate downforce to keep the front end down, stop it wheeling perhaps. They can also move in opposite directions. So one suggestion through the patent is that it would help the bike change lean angle, that you basically lift one side and dip the other. And another suggestion is that both winglets could be set in the lift position to make the steering lighter when you're flicking from one lean angle to the other. Will you ever feel any of that on a road bike? Hard to say, really. Aerodynamics like this tend to work at high speed rather than low speed. So at road legal speed, I very much doubt anybody will be feeling it. And I would suggest that most track riders probably won't notice either. What is unlikely, though, is the suggestion that you could create air brake effect by turning these little winglets into the wind. Well, stick the bike in neutral at 60 miles an hour, make sure you've got a nice empty road, and just see how long it takes you to slow down. And then try slowing down again, sitting up, as opposed to flat on the tank, and see how much difference it makes. It really does make a great deal of difference. But what you do find is, of course, this aerodynamic drag will be at the expense of fuel consumption. So yeah, it probably won't stop it becoming a must-have necessary accessory for next year, but hey ho. Right, okay, last topic of the day, motorcycle helmets. Now, they weigh quite a lot of weight. They're heavy, and when you are riding a motorcycle, you are balancing this weight on top of your already heavy head. Now, the neck and the muscles in it are already mechanically stressed simply because of the weight of our own head. And sticking a helmet on top of this makes everything even more difficult. In fact, it's particularly awkward for women. I discovered, I was doing some reading around this, and I discovered that a lot of women actually suffer chronic neck pain because they're basically wearing the same weight of helmet as the average bloke, but they have smaller muscles and smaller bones. So, you know, there are issues with wearing a helmet even at the best of times. Now, most of us will have been off the bike now for quite some considerable time. What that means is we lose the strength in those neck muscles that we've built up over the time of wearing a helmet. So if you're going to get back on the bike and expect you to get straight back on as you got off it, as I've been talking about over the last few weeks, you will get a bit of a shock. So what can you do? Well, first things first is that you can think about the job that you're going to do. One of the problems with the neck muscles is wind blast. I can fully remember switching from a fared motorcycle to an unfared motorcycle and having to do a high-speed dash to catch a ferry. And my neck hurt like buggery at the end of a 120-mile ride, which it wouldn't have done on my bike with a fairing. So simple solution if you're getting neck strain at speed is get a windshield of some sort. Higher screen perhaps. They do create turbulence and noise, but you know, think about how you can keep the wind off the rider. A lot of people buy nakeds, but yeah, you are exposing yourself to that wind. If you are around town, it's not an issue, but out of town at high speed, it is a problem. Second thing, have a look at the back of the helmet and see how much it weighs. Now, one of the problems with flip front helmets, particularly, I use these obviously for bike training, is that they weigh quite a lot. They're extra heavy compared with a standard full face helmet. And of course, they're both much heavier than an open face. So the thing to do is check the weight, which is on a sticker, and see which ones are light. Don't go for the look at the pattern on it or the brand name, but actually think about which one weighs less. And then if you can find one that fits as well, that'll be a better buy than a heavier helmet. Carbon fiber obviously weighs less than standard plastic helmets. So even small savings, 500 grams or so, can help significantly. The other thing is your posture as you're sitting on the bike. Now, this is something I talk about a lot all the time. A lot of riders have bad posture on the bike. And if you are leaning forward, your head is naturally going to be tilted back. And that's not the natural angle for the neck. So the more forward leaning you are on the bike, the worse your neck posture is. So have a think about that. If you are suffering from neck pain, you can make a couple of changes to the bike. This is something that Dave Moss was talking about last week. You could perhaps increase the height of your handlebars. If you've got tubular handlebars, which are on standard clamps on the middle of the forks, you can get risers which bolt in and basically just lift the handlebars up a couple of inches. You have to be careful because it causes all sorts of problems with wiring and cables and hydraulics, but it can be done. Something else that can help if you are of shorter stature is if the bars are a long way away from you, if you're reaching out to those handlebars, you will naturally be leaning forward. Move the bars back towards you and you make your riding posture more upright. You support that neck. So if you have neck issues, changing the riding posture of the bike can work. Ultimately, you may need to think about changing the bike altogether. I had a trainee out a couple of years ago who was having terrible problems with his neck. He was basically, he had the top of the range GSX R1000, the one with all the electronic gizmos on it, brand new bike. And he'd been riding these GSXR since he passed his test 4 or 5 years earlier. He was in his mid-50s and he'd never been comfortable on any of them. He was trying to do an advanced training course. And the real problem with virtually everything we did on that course was down to his posture. He couldn't look over his shoulder. He couldn't steer because he couldn't move. And I said that, go and get yourself the upright model. There's a full Monty GSX 1000 with all the gizmos on it, but with an upright riding position. He honestly didn't like that answer, but it was the right one for him. So think about what your bike is doing to you before you do anything else. Okay, now you can do some exercises as well to help. There are, again, go onto the internet, have a look round. The neck strengthening exercises, some of them are very simple. Once again, get your doctor's advice if you think you need it. Don't do anything that hurts. If it's painful, stop. Any exercise regime should be started gently and carefully, and repetitions are more important than force. So build light exercises and build up gradually. There are a couple of simple ones which will help enormously, and one of those is simply to bend your head down, hold it there for 5 seconds and raise it back up again, because that will work those muscles which help support your head at the back of your neck. You can do neck tilts from side to side, because again they are the muscles that work the around the neck and help support the head. Again, tilt, hold for 5 seconds and then return. Do stretching exercises to left and right. Again, one of the things that a lot of older riders have is restricted neck movement. They can't look over their shoulder. You can do those exercises. It will help. Something else you can do is lay on the floor and then lift your head off the floor. Again, you're working a different set of muscles. So try those. As I say, there are plenty of videos online which will give you some exercises to do. You can also do some resistance exercises. Basically, all you do is you use the pressure of your hand and you push against your hand. So that'll help build up those muscles. So think about your neck. You can look after it by using lightweight helmets, by using a bike which gives you sensible posture. But you can also help enormously to build up the strength again before you go out riding. And last but not least, of course, if you are a regular rider and you're suddenly off on a world cruise on your motorcycle, you're going to be doing long miles. A lot of riders really don't realize the stress of a long day in the saddle, and the neck does take a beating at high speed. If you are motoring 500 miles down the motorway, even with a fairing, your head will take a battering and your neck will be sore. Trust me, I've been there, I've done it. So there we go. Think about that, give you some exercises to play with. The last thing I wanted to say on that was there is a BMF article which gives you some stretching exercises to do as you ride, not literally as you ride, but when you come to a standstill, to help relieve some of the pains and aches that people get as they're riding. And what I'll do is I'll put the link to that up in a minute. So, right, okay, we're out of time again. We've romped through. I've overrun slightly today. So thank you for watching Elevenses today. Don't forget part 2 of the interview with Dave Moss, which I pre-recorded. I'll be showing that tomorrow. Dave will talk about suspension setup. It's quite a long session. It's quite complex. So what I suggest is that you read it, and then you head over possibly to my YouTube channel, Survival Skills UK. Don't forget that all important UK on the end, and re-watch it when I put it up over there, because there is a lot to take in that Dave's talking about, but it is bloody useful stuff. So, right, thanks again. That's all for today. Catch you tomorrow. Take care out there and ride safe.